All right. So this week, content-wise, World War II has ended. The Cold War has begun. Um, Places are locked down. The United States and the Soviet Union have both started expanding their influence all over the world. But everyone else in the world kind of had a say in what was happening too, right? So this week is kind of looking at everything that happened in regards to other countries, countries that weren't necessarily involved in the Cold War, that may have been distantly influenced by them, but definitely not directly, right? So these are all countries that essentially were neutral in the Cold War. They didn't side with the Americans, they didn't side with the Soviets, they just were outside of the ordinary. Now, if you look at the time period for this chapter, it covers everything from 1945 all the way to 1993. That's a huge time frame where a lot of things have changed, considering all the other time frames we've looked at have been like 20-year increments for the last couple weeks. So we're going to look at a lot of those things. Some of them happen in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. Other things happen in the 80s and the 90s, right? So it does cover quite a bit of range, and it does cover quite a bit of different things. Right? So today we're going to cover just starting out the first part of the chapter. So lesson 1 and 2. Lesson 1 is all about South and Southeast Asia. Lesson 2 is about the Middle East. So we're going to cover those. We're going to essentially hit the portions of the world that were, I would argue, the most confrontational during this time period. Other places certainly had activity going on, but there were full-out civil wars and major disputes and wars between other countries that occurred during this time period in both Southeast Asia as well as the Middle East. Right. So lesson 1. South and Southeast Asia, right? So anytime that you see South Asia, it's basically just talking about India. And that's how the first part of this chapter begins. It talks about the need for Indian independence, right? They had spent the last several hundred years being a British colony, and frankly, they hated it. Got to a point where they felt like they needed to gain their independence, and the person who is most widely attributed to this movement and this cause and the actual gaining of Indian independence is Mahatma Gandhi, right? So, so Gandhi is essentially going to be seen as the figurehead. He is the guy that the Indian people can rally behind. And he does everything through series of peaceful protests. He is absolutely not in any way, shape, or form violent towards any form of protest. He is all about peaceful protests. Now, these include things like hunger strikes, where he would go days or even weeks without eating to protest over certain different aspects of the Indian government. And by all accounts, it was an extremely effective way to handle things. So when India was gaining its independence, when they were going through this struggle to kind of get rid of British influences, there are several different major things that kind of got in the way of this. And one of those is the fact that India is an extremely diverse country. It has a lot of different things going on. And it has a lot of different major religions also present. So you've got Sikhs, you've got Buddhists, you've got Muslims, Hindus, all of them trying to blend and rally behind one aspect made it really hard for the country to truly unify. Right. So even though they were gaining their independence and they were getting rid of the British people and the British influence, they still were looking for one identity to be able to rally behind. Right. So when Gandhi was essentially going through his movement, if you will, he definitely ruffled some feathers. Right. So he, throughout the process of protesting, made the British government extremely frustrated, aggravated. But he also aggravated some other people that wanted a violent overthrow. And just like a lot of major people who are independence leaders or movement leaders, he ends up getting assassinated for his beliefs. Gandhi famously thought that he wasn't going to see Indian independence in his lifetime, but he did, however, think that with his death would come independence. And what he meant by that is he thought of himself as almost like he was going to have to be a martyr. He thought if he was 100% behind his cause, the only way that it would really step up and make a difference is if he was the one who ended up dying because of this movement, right? And he was right. Once Gandhi dies, the movement proceeds rapidly. He's assassinated January 30th of 1948, and by 1950, the government has been completely overthrown, put into place, and an Indian person has been elected their new prime minister, right? So it's the India's Congress Party ends up becoming like the leaders, with Gandhi's partner essentially in crime, Nehru, right? So throughout this time period, though, once Indian nationals have taken over their country, they have a couple major great things and some major down things that also happen, right? So their population explodes. India triples in size in about a 20-year stretch from 1950 to 1965. So in 15 years, their population triples. Right now, what that means is that with 3 times as many people, you're going to need 3 times as much food. You're going to need 3 times as many jobs, right? So all of these different things are things that they weren't necessarily planning on. So because of that, the government wasn't really ready to handle those things. And the Indian government really, really struggled during this time. They tried to do several different things. They tried to go to more state-run industries while still maintaining private properties. But all in all, India as a country was really still trying to figure everything out. It certainly didn't have a concrete idea of what it was yet or what it was going to be. Right? In terms of South Asia, on the borders there, you also have Pakistan and Bangladesh. Pakistan goes through a civil war during this time period, and it ends up forming what would be 2 separate countries. Bangladesh forms out of East Pakistan, and Pakistan forms out of West Pakistan. So each side, essentially, of India had its own kind of disputes. So whenever we talk about East and West Pakistan, they weren't right next to each other. One is on this side, then you have India in the middle, and then you have the other one, right? So East Pakistan is way over here, then you have India, then you have West Pakistan. So West Pakistan becomes what we know today as modern-day Pakistan. East Pakistan, though, turns into Bangladesh, and that is all the way on the other side of India, all the way down in the corner, kind of by Burma, where we're going to talk now. So moving away from India into the rest of Southeast Asia. Right? So Southeast Asia is going to be essentially the little inlet area down below China, but to the east of India, right? So it's little corner countries there. Some major ones that it talks about in here, you have Indonesia and Myanmar. So Myanmar is what we would essentially used to call Burma. So Burma was the name of the country. Once it gains its independence, it renames itself to Myanmar. Right now, when this occurs, this is not in any way, shape, or form a simple and easy break. This was done through an election and then a war. What's wild about it is that the military completely takes control over Myanmar. To this day, the military is still in control there. So they would have an election, they would elect a president, and then that president gets put in house arrest for the rest of their life. It's the most figurehead, not real thing that they could ever hope for. They have an election, and any time that the general doesn't win, whoever wins just gets put in arrest. That's it. The military holds all of the power. They do not allow anyone to actually gain any real power unless they are a member of the military and they are high-ranking enough to justify being in that position. When Myanmar is going through this, that's really the only thing you need to know about it. Essentially, is that it is a military state that formed attempting to be a democracy, but that got shut down pretty much immediately, unfortunately for them. Right. So, sorry, 1 second here. There we go. So on top of that, the other country that you have in here is Indonesia, right? So Indonesia also was looking to become essentially a we'll say, anti-Soviet government. They weren't going to be a major democracy, but they also weren't going to be communist in any way, right? So they were really looking to not rely on the Soviet Union and China. But then once everything kind of went through, and the United States essentially got, all of their power to become existing, because the United States backed Indonesia under this whole like stopping of communism spreading policy that existed during the Cold War. Once they completely dissolved, once Indonesia completely gained its freedom, they relatively quickly dissolved their constitution. They looked for aid from the Soviet Union and China, and as soon as that happened, it resulted in their overthrow and a replacement by the military. So in both of these countries, in Indonesia and Myanmar, the military takes control of the government during this time. After that, we have Vietnam and Cambodia, both of which are undergoing major catastrophes. In North Vietnam, you've got a communist dictator in charge. To this day, it has still gone down the same family line. It was Kim Il Sung, and then it was Kim Jong Il, and then it was Kim Jong Il, then Kim Il Sung, then now we're on to Kim Jong Un. So it has been passed down through their family where they've led. There have been millions of people that have starved to death during this reign. In terms of Cambodia goes through what is known as the Cambodian Death March. The Khmer Rouge is a communist party that forms under the leader Pol Pot. And Pol Pot basically rounds up anyone and everyone that has ever said anything nice about the United States or anything not communist, essentially. And he literally marches them into rice fields and executes over 1 million people get killed in what is a massive genocide of anti-communist people. It is extremely devastating because they also set out landmines to try and just take out random civilians. They use children to go out and find landmines, knowing that if they find them, at least they'll die quickly. And it's really, really sad and upsetting in every way, shape, and form. The Philippines have a different kind of thing moving for them. So in the Philippines, they are definitely moving towards a democracy. They get rid of their corrupt leader. They have this giant reform movement. And the problem that happens there is that whenever they have this massive reform, it ends up falling short. They go through everything and they want to be able to solve everything, but the person that they elect into it, Corazon Aquino, eventually kind of realizes that all of her policies and things aren't going to solve all this social and economic difficulties because there's just too much corruption within their government. We won't see a massive change in the Philippines in terms of power and corruption to this day. Right now in the Philippines, there is arguably one of the most corrupt people in power in the world. So whether or not the Philippines are a democracy or not really doesn't matter whenever the leader gets rid of all of the power from those under them. When it comes to women's rights in South and Southeast Asia, the major achievements that you're going to look at here are going to be in India. They get rid of a couple major things. They get rid of gender discrimination and child marriage. Because if you were a girl, you used to get married off to somebody well before you were a teenager. It was already determined who you were going to marry and when you were going to get married. You didn't have any say in it at all. They also mandated equal pay for equal work, meaning when a man and a woman do the same job, they should get paid the same amount. That's not going to be the case in Southeast Asia. So women get granted full equality there, but they definitely have not made as many moves in terms of advancements up the social ladder. They've steadily become better educated, They've become more politically active, but they aren't really in positions of power in very many places in those countries. And that's a harsh reality of kind of change, is that it takes a while for countries to kind of realize what they need to do or what they should be doing, right? So just kind of know that that's the way in which it was trending. Moving on to lesson 2, the Middle East. The Middle East goes through a series of major crises during this time period that honestly never quite have ended yet. We still have massive problems with the Middle East, and the Middle East has problems with people within themselves due to outside influence and also interior influences, right? So after World War II, one of the first things that happens is that because of the Holocaust and because of sympathy essentially for the Jewish cause and the Jewish movement, there essentially is the United Nations, and they make a proposal, and they basically tell Palestine, you are now going to be split in half. We're going to acknowledge there's going to be a Palestinian state and there is going to be a Jewish state. When that occurs, on May 14th, 1948, the Jews then claim the entire territory instead of just the half they're delegated, and establish the new state of Israel. When they do this, it leads to a massive argument, if you will, over whether or not that was right or wrong or even allowable. So the Arab world sees this as a massive betrayal. They think that this is not okay for the Palestinian Arabs. They shouldn't have to live under a Jewish country's rule, even after they have been in control of their own country for a long time, really, before this. When this occurs, though, some Palestinian Arabs become Israeli citizens. Others flee to other Arab countries. But ultimately, it ends up resulting in a very long, very heated, still ongoing fight between the two groups. So the Palestinian Arabs that had lived in the state of Israel that we now call it today, they'd been living there beforehand. And then the United Nations comes in and says, no, you're now going to be Israel, and you're going to be under Jewish rule instead of under Muslim leadership that you've had before. This is a massive, massive fight that has been ongoing. There have been bombings, there have been terrorist attacks on both sides, by both sides. To this day, they still have armed guards all around fighting over whether or not certain areas should be under Jewish control or Muslim control. It has been ongoing, and certainly doesn't look like it's going to be stopping anytime soon, unfortunately. When it comes to this idea of the Palestinians finding somewhere else to live, they don't really want to. They want to live the place where they have grown up, where they have been essentially there before, but they didn't have the support. Israel had the support of the United Nations at the time, and more importantly, during this time period, Israel had the support of the United States. And to this day, the United States is Israel's hands down biggest supporter in the region. And because of that, the Palestinians had to find support from the other countries around them. So what they eventually result to was oftentimes referred to as Pan-Arabism, where they're going to look to try and unite all Arabs under one banner, so that way they can all look to do what's best for their other Arab countries, countrymen, and just in general, people, right? So when this occurs, a couple big things happen. Egypt ends up becoming the leader in this movement. Egypt regains control of the Suez Canal. They have gained their independence from Britain. And with that, one of the first things they do is they basically partner up with the actual citizens and say, we will help you move towards this movement of all Arabs uniting, right? So they end up forming what is called the United Arab Republic. They do this with Syria. And whenever they form all of this, the big thing they were looking to do is to try to unite the entire region. But it didn't work. One of the first and biggest reasons it didn't work is that some of the other countries that are around them are extremely rich in oil. So you've got a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, Iraq, who have a ton of money within the oil industry, and they basically go, why would we unite with you guys? That means that we're going to have to support you, and we're going to have to give you things. And we like selling all of our oil to the rest of the world. We don't want to just unite this as an Arab thing. We want to make this a global thing. So the idea of Pan-Arabism never really pans out. It never ends up actually working. And because of that, Egypt essentially takes matters into their own hands. And we end up seeing Egypt and Syria both launch an attack against Israel, which is oftentimes called the Yom Kippur War. And that's because they attack on Yom Kippur. It's a Jewish holiday. And when Egypt and Syria do this, it ends up leading in a war declaration from Israel that ultimately ends up getting negotiated in a ceasefire. That ceasefire doesn't come for over a year. So for a year, Egypt, Syria, and Israel were all at war with one another in the 70s. But when that ends, it doesn't really get rid of any of the hostilities. There's a ceasefire, but they still don't agree on anything, essentially. When that occurs, the only time that we would see an end to this, really, would be in 1979. The United States President, Jimmy Carter, invites the Egyptian king as well as the Israeli prime minister. They invite them both to what is called Camp David. Camp David is where the president has his own little retreat, kind of hideout place for him to vacation on weekends. So they invite them to Camp David, and when they're there, they make an agreement and they officially stop the war. When this happens, the agreement ends the war, but it only ends the war between those countries. A lot of other places within the Middle East still refuse to acknowledge Israel existing as a country. They don't think it should even exist. They think that it should be still Palestine, that it should be under Palestinian rule. So because they refuse to even acknowledge Israel's existence, they don't really think this piece of paper saying we're done with this war really means all that much, right? When this occurs, the Palestinians essentially say, all right, well, if Egypt's not going to fight our war for us anymore, we need to fight our own war. And then they really ramp up everything and end up forming what is called the Palestine Liberation Organization. And it's essentially looking to make the state that we recognize as Israel be referred to as the state recognized as Palestine under Palestinian Muslim rule, right? A couple other major things that happen in the Middle East, OPEC forms, and these are essentially referred to as the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this is going to be a collection of all of the countries in the Middle East. Petroleum is oil, so essentially just look at it that way, but it's essentially a grouping of all of the countries that sell oil from the Middle East that say we need to band together, and if we all join together, we don't have to fight one another over the price of this. We can set the price of oil, right? And they pretty much do still set the price of oil. There currently, right now, is an oil war going on between Russia and OPEC. And when this occurred, both of them were basically flooding the market, making oil extremely cheap and extremely available. And they're essentially trying to price each other out to say, well, we've got more, we can sell it for less, which is why you've seen gas prices drop to almost close to $1 a gallon when literally 2 months ago they were almost $3 a gallon. The price of oil has been dropping immediately right now, an insane amount. And it's because OPEC formed, right? So because in the 60s, OPEC united, it allows them to kind of dictate the market, and they can set prices on things. And they have a lot of bargaining power, right? So that's OPEC, and it's important that you kind of know that exists as an entity, because in the future, if you're ever wondering why the price of gas is what it is, look at how much OPEC is charging for oil, and that'll kind of determine whether it's going to be high or low, right? Now, moving on away from kind of the Egypt and Israel and Palestine conflicts, we're going to move into Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So Iran goes through a revolution in the 50s and 60s. So in the 50s and 60s, Iran was run essentially by a United States ally. This was a secular leader, which means he's not related to any religious affiliation at all. He's just a president. He was the president of Iran. He was essentially running the country the way that the United States wanted them to. However, many Muslims within the country felt that Iran's culture had become too greedy and materialistic, and they essentially blamed the United States for this. So all of this sentiment has been building up, and people that had originally been part of a culture that was very united and very community-driven have become more capitalist-driven. And they've seen some people make a ton of money off of oil, while regular common people really haven't, and they start getting poorer and poorer, and they see this as a movement of greed, right? So by the late 70s, a bunch of Iranians had this massive support all behind a Muslim clergyman. His name was the Ayatollah Khomeini, right? And in 1979, the Shah's government collapses and Khomeini takes charge of a new Islamic republic. This leads to a massive anti-American sentiment. They hold 52 embassy members hostage for over a year. And when the hostage crisis ends, the only reason that it really ends is with the switching of the guard from President Carter to President Reagan. We threatened to go to war with them. And they essentially back down and they give us back our prisoners. But it leads to a massive battle that is still ongoing today. Iran still is extremely anti-American. The United States is also very anti-Iran, right? So when this kind of dispute erupts, it essentially creates a country within the Middle East that is extremely anti-American, right? Iran is going to be the leader behind the anti-American movement within the region, but it doesn't end there, right? Iran and Iraq have a border that they share, but they don't really share very much in common. Iran is a mostly Shia Muslim country, whereas Iraq is almost entirely Sunni. This difference sparks a massive uneasy relationship. They get into a whole bunch of theoretical and philosophical fights that eventually boil over into an actual war. Saddam Hussein was the dictator in Iraq, and when he takes power in 1980, he launches a war against Iran. Again, in here, this is terrible. They take prisoners of war and they force the children from the other side to go clear minefields. So that way, again, they were less expendable, so that way they wouldn't lose a soldier. Poison gas gets used against both sides. Citizens, not on the armies, but they use it on just regular people. They send in nerve gas, they send in a bunch of different poison gases that kill entire cities just because they have a disagreement on which type of Muslim the other one should be. Essentially, they end up resolving their fight into a ceasefire in 1988. This war lasts for 8 years, right? So for 8 years, that's longer than World War II, right? Iran and Iraq are at war with one another over their border. When they agree to a ceasefire, they don't resolve any of their issues. They basically say, we won't be at war anymore, but we still hate you, right? So each side never really resolves the conflict. They just agree not to fight anymore, right? Then in 1990, Saddam Hussein attempts to seize the oil-rich nation of Kuwait. It's a very tiny little country that had a massive agreement with the United States. Because of that, the United States leads a multinational force of United Nations countries. So there are soldiers from Australia, France, Britain, Germany, Africa, China, that all agree to join and come with us to go in there. They try to impose economic sanctions and say that, like, haha, like, we'll stop you this way. We won't buy any of your oil, and instead we will, force you guys into submission in hopes that the people would overthrow Hussein. They don't. They leave Saddam Hussein in power. But we do get them to push back. They don't, and they leave Kuwait. They don't come back for a little while. So ultimately, it is generally seen as a success from stopping the country of Kuwait being taken over. And then we're going to move to Afghanistan, where the more troubled relationship exists during this time. Afghanistan had a massive fight with the Soviet Union. For 10 years, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan and then takes over this country and attempts to essentially form it as a new communist country within the group. But they did not want this. Within Afghanistan, there's a group called the Mujahideen. And within the Mujahideen, they were a group of people that were extremely anti-communist. If you're looking for the leaders of that group, they're led by people like Osama bin Laden. He is one of the leaders within it, and he is extremely well supported by the United States. The United States pays for the Mujahideen's weapons. We send them all of the things they used to fight off against the Soviets. They are supported in every way by the United States and Pakistan. But once the Soviet Union is gone, once the Soviets leave, the United States basically goes, okay, figure it out. And whenever all of the people within Afghanistan say, hey, wait, you guys just gave us all these weapons, we just had a war, all of our hospitals and our schools are all blown up, we need help. The United States said, yeah, but no. And they don't help. They don't help rebuild the country that they paid for a war to happen in. And when this happens, there is a massive pushback against the United States. With this, a group takes over called the Taliban. The Taliban comes in, they seize and take over almost 2/3 of the country, and within them, Osama bin Laden becomes the leader within this group. The Taliban is responsible for the attacks in 9/11, right? And they did that mainly as a way of kind of getting back at the United States for not helping them after their war. After the Soviets come in and after the United States helps and then leaves, it is this massive drive to get all Westerners out of the Middle East. They really don't want anyone who is not an Arab to live in any or be in any Arab country. So within this, it is a massive extremist push. This is not a standard normal thing that most Muslims would agree with. It is an extremist group, but they're an extremist group driven because their country was completely destroyed. They were left with little to nothing and they needed someone to blame. And because we weren't there when they needed us, they blamed us, right? Throughout all of these countries, there is a massive push back towards more fundamentalist things, right? So the West is viewed as materialistic and greedy and immoral. So the Muslim countries within this area all tend to take more pushbacks to more traditional things. So before this, early Muslim women had legal and political and social options, and they kind of all get taken away. There becomes this more traditional role for women. Women lose a lot of power. Women lose a lot of their independence. And frankly, they lose a lot of their freedom within the group of countries that are all overtaken during this time. And with that, we see a massive kind of pushback to more traditional early women stay home, they don't work, you take care of the family, that's it kind of push. Whereas before that, leading into the 70s, women had a lot of different roles. They could go to work, they could be high up in the social status, they could have all kinds of different things that they could do, but they lose a lot of the last section in here talks about different Nobel winners and different people that have talked about literature and other things. But it is really important to realize that in both of these areas of the world, I'm sorry, I guess in all three, in Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, these are not peaceful times. These are times for upheaval, civil wars, genocides, all kinds of things happen there for each one of those areas and those countries to gain their independence, right? They aren't looking to be reliant on anyone else, and they certainly don't want any other countries messing with anything that they have going on. So it's a very different kind of push than we're going to see in the other regions of the world. So with that, that wraps up lesson 1 and 2. If you have any questions, by all means, you can ask them at this point. We'll also be on for office hours every day from 1 until 3. So if you have any questions, please feel free to stop by and